All right, good morning, Valencia students, and welcome to our first official lecture on course materials entitled, What is Western Civilization? Today we will look at some of the concepts of where the idea of Western civilization comes from and compare it to elements of Eastern civilization and to ask some questions of how did Homo sapiens live prior to this phenomenon of civilization? And as we will be asking in our reflection essays, the great question, is civilization really all that civilized and great? Hence why we are here by a lake, watching a sunrise, doing something different than we normally would in Western civilization in the morning. So, for all of our lectures, we will start out with a series of questions of thematic concepts about the topic that we're covering for today. So our thematic questions about what is civilization is first and foremost, how do scientists study humans before written language came about? Is this the job of the historian to study these humans, or is it the job of other fields? Our second question we'll look at is asking some ideas about what are the perceived differences between the West and the East? Where does our concept of Western civilization come from, and how is it potentially distinctly different, or is this simply just a construct that we've made up over time? Our third question is, what is needed for civilization? What defines civilization? Why do people choose to create civilizations? And our final question, which will be a common theme in all of our lectures, is asking the great question, what can we learn from our prehistoric past? And what I mean by prehistory, from the time when human beings did not write down documents for historians to analyze. So, what is Western civilization, and how is the study of Western civilization different and distinct from the study of what we would call world history? What has occurred in the last 30 years is a huge paradigm shift where traditionally, when it came down to colleges and universities, and even in high schools, is that students simply learned about a concept of Western civilization, which was looking at a study of European peoples, their ideas, and the major events that occurred in European history to define patterns of modern development, and particularly the formation of the United States. Over the last 30 years with globalization, and particularly with the renewed rise of China, is that historians have switched over more to studying elements of world history. The study of world history is profoundly different because it is a study of international patterns of cultural and economic development that led to modern globalization. In a much simpler sense, world history asks the question, how did China seem to, for a period, decline from its status as the dominant power of the world, which it had held for almost 3,000 years, to now in the 21st century, coming back as a major dominant power? What about those patterns of globalization? Well, we are going to attempt to do in our own study of Western civilization, because Western civilization still has a very important role to play in the study of our history, is we are going to try to reject concepts of Eurocentrism and talk more about concepts of what I'd call Eurodominance. A traditional Eurocentric study of Western civilization would be simply praising European peoples for being superior to others. It's a loaded term that somehow Europeans and people who are white are civilized. In a very binary concept, that would mean that others who are not white and European are somehow uncivilized and need white European race people to rule over them. What we will do instead in our own study, since we'll be covering almost 4,000 years of history, is to look at how Europe transformed over time and eventually how Europeans came to be a huge dominant power and player of world power. What was it that led to that domination? We will try to provide a critical historical analysis based upon social scientific evidence rather than a simple cultural norm of talking about European superiority to other peoples. So while this terminology is used less and less in the 21st century in our more globalized world with China playing a dominant role, traditionally, going all the way back to Greek society in the ancient times, is there was a concept of what they called Eastern civilization versus Western civilization. The Greeks were the first to come up with this concept, and the way that they defined it was that anything that lied east of their own borders, well, that was Eastern civilization, and where the sun set upon the west, well, that was Western civilization. The problem with that paradigm is that even though the Greeks expanded greatly in their own empire, is they did not take over many places that we now call West. One of the other profound questions we have to ask is, when we talk about Western civilization, do we include places like Africa? Are South American and Central American nations ever really paid attention to in the concept of Western civilization? Or is it simply a loaded term to talk about Europeans and to talk about people who are citizens of the United States of America and Canada? Traditionally, the way we've thought of Eastern civilization was a variety of paradigms to understand how these people were somehow distinctly different. Oftentimes, historians in the West tried to claim that Eastern civilization, that these civilizations that were based upon an idea of collectivism, the individuals lacked any sense of individual or human rights, and that this was somehow in opposition to the values of the West. What they also believed was that people who lived in Eastern societies had a collective concept of hierarchy, essentially that they did not believe in their own individual power as a citizen, but they thought of themselves as subjects who had to follow and obey the rule, perhaps of an emperor per se. Along with this came within their culture a deference to strong leadership, whether it be the emperor, whether it be the father figure, and that the role within Eastern societies, or another way of oftentimes putting it, Asiatic societies, was for people simply to defer to a strong leadership, to censor their own personal emotions, and according to many historians in the West traditionally, historians have tried to argue that this somehow held back the progress of Eastern civilization. If we look at the values that are traditionally associated with the West, we will see that they have been framed in essentially a complete opposite binary. Traditionally, historians have tried to praise the West, saying that the West and our own values were promoters of individual rights, that we were the ones who came up with the concept of human rights and the value of protecting the individual from any type of authority or hierarchy that could be tyrannical or oppressive. What we also claim to believe within Western civilization is a sense of a collective authority. One way of putting that is the concept of democracy, that people who live within a nation state should have some type of say upon the government that rules over them. Along with this, we have argued that our own societies, our cultural beliefs, and our governments are set up in ways to protect the expression of individualism. Things such as the American Bill of Rights is to protect the individual from the potential tyranny of the government. What we've oftentimes argued when it comes down to the study of Western civilization then was that these different notions about the individual and the questioning of authority led to people in the West having a far superior advancement in bringing forward human progress, particularly with events such as in the 18th and 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. I would argue that these traditional paradigms that we have tried to frame in simple binaries, that the reality of this is, in the most basic of social scientific terminology I can say, absolute and complete historic rubbish. Since the dawn of civilization, as people settled in different areas, the world has been interconnected. While the people of the Americas, until the voyages of Columbus, as well as the Norwegians about 300 years earlier, the people of the Americas were isolated from other patterns in the world due to the fact that these continents were separated. But the peoples of Africa, of Europe, of the Middle East, and throughout Asia, once they discovered each other's civilizations, they interconnected, they shared ideas, they shared values, and in particular, they shared things such as technologies. One of the themes that we'll try to explore as we go throughout our historic narrative of trying to understand Western civilization is that many of the things that we say, oh, were created by white people in the West, in reality, were usually created in China hundreds and hundreds of years prior to these things appearing in places such as Europe. And that people such as religious missionaries in their interactions with other people, in their interactions as diplomats, is they learned these technologies from the Chinese, imported them to Europe, and then developed them in their own unique ways. So what we'll see is that the world has always been interconnected, and you can't simply look at the world in a simple paradigm of West versus East, as we did through much of the 20th century in the Cold War, but we need to understand that our values as human beings are really quite similar with most cultures throughout the world. While we might have very distinct ways that we try to manifest them in our own unique national culture, is that human beings at the end of the day, as we come together, are essentially, in many ways, all the same. So one of the goals laid out for this course in the Valencia course catalog is to understand something about the nature of how historians study things and what is distinct about history as a social science. Oftentimes people get confused and they think that history and the past, well, that they're the same thing. And while they are phenomena that are very much related, they are distinctly different in many, many specific ways. If we think about the past is essentially anything that happened right before this very moment. Now, the issue with that is that very rarely things that happen leave any type of documentary evidence. If we have witnesses to an event, people's memories, well, they change over time. If they start talking with other people who were there, they influence their memories. Oftentimes things of the past are forgotten or simply reimagined. And that is how it's related to history, because the word of history is story. History is about telling stories about the past, but in a very specific way. I've defined history here as the branch of the social sciences that records, analyzes, and interprets past events through a systematic evaluation of verifiable evidence. What is key for historians, and it's one of the great challenges of a course dealing with elements of ancient history, is that we need documents. We need written language. There are other branches of these social sciences that look at other things outside of written documents and attempt to analyze them and to bring together patterns of stories, but these particular stories don't really qualify as history. And it's a very frustrating thing for historians, because even we are aware of things that have happened in the past, unless we have some type of written documentary evidence about it, is we can't qualify the study of these things as the basis of history. So one of our great challenges of studying ancient history is that prior to written language, is that historians have to rely upon people called archaeologists. Archaeologists who come through, they study different pots, they study the way cities are set up, and they try to piece together a narrative that seems to make some sense, but it's not based upon documents. The other great challenge of studying elements of ancient history is that many of the written documents that we do have are associated with different religious faiths. And that can cause great controversy oftentimes when the social scientist comes in to try to study something about the past, and we find conflicting evidence that goes against what was documented, oftentimes in holy texts. So when it comes down to ancient history, what are the challenges that are facing the historian in trying to piece together the early history of Homo sapiens in Western civilization? So as social scientists, what historians have to do is to confront the reality of documents that exist and to be able to make sure that the evidence we have is verifiable. It's not good enough simply to have one document. We need to have multiple documents about events that happen so we can compare and contrast different people's stories to try and piece things together. Oftentimes, though, the phenomena of history can come into conflict with the phenomenon of faith. If we look at history and why history is important in humanity, first and foremost, history gives humanity a sense of meaning. When we understand things that occurred in the past, when we know when people have tried different things in the past, is we can learn from those experiences and not make the same mistakes again. History also gives humanity a sense of progress. We like to think about human beings once being tribalistic, being hunter-gatherers. Eventually, we settled down into villages, we created agriculture, we created cities, we created civilization, and by the 20th century, we were flying through the sky, and now in the 21st century, is we can look at that series of progress and say, my goodness, we're about to put together a permanent base on the moon. We're about to try and send people to Mars. And what that does for human beings is gives us a common sense of identity. The problem with not knowing history is that people can tell you anything about the past, and unless you have some type of science to analyze the past, is you have no way of checking up on things. History gives us a concrete identity to understand something about the past and to give us a sense of progress as to where human beings are going, whether it be in a civilization or in our own individual lives. We like to trace things and think about that we were a child, then we were teenagers, and we were our young adult period. Then perhaps we got married, perhaps we became parents. We like to see a linear progress and to document such things because it gives us a sense of collective meaning. Now here's the challenge then when it's history and we talk about the phenomenon of faith, because faith gives humanity also the same things. It gives us a sense of meaning. Oftentimes, faith-based concepts of the past involve something with a divine creator. The idea that human beings are somehow special and unique upon this planet, and that there's something that links us together, not just with each other, but with something larger than us, a way to explain the natural world. Along with this, particularly if we look at the faiths in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that the holy texts of these particular books give a concept of progress. It starts in the beginning, the 7 days of creation, and then it gives an end story of the end of times and a time when Jesus of Nazareth will come back to reign over humanity. The idea that this God connected with this faith is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, that God can see through all things at all time. And if we feel a common connection with something so much larger than us, is it gives us a sense of identity. Particularly within those faiths is that the Protestant denominations that we will study at the very end of our 6 weeks together give people a very specific sense of individuals, that each of us are special children of God. Now, here's the issue. Does conflict have to be inevitable? And I would like to put forth the argument that no, conflict doesn't have to be inevitable. It's about looking at things and being able to compartmentalize and to realize that the purpose of history and the purpose of faith, while it has common phenomenon with each other, they exist for different reasons. History is here to try to link human beings with other human beings and to give life to those of the past. Faith is about trying to take the human being, to connect with the divine, and to think about a concept of a heavenly future. So they are both about studying the human experience, but studying it for very different reasons and in very different ways. One way we can try to understand this phenomenon of why there does not need to be a conflict between social science and between faith is to think about something such as astronomy and astrology. Both of these disciplines look to the skies and they study the stars. They study the planets. But the way that they look at them and the purpose of it has highly different meanings. If we think about something like astronomy, I remember in my young years when the Hubble telescope was launched and we could get some of these images of the far out reaches of the universe. And in studying these things and studying things based upon the speed of light, is that astronomers could look to the skies and help to piece together a story about the past, which they believe that story based upon the past, looking at the evidence of the stars, leads back to a phenomenon of creation such as the Big Bang. Now, if we think about astrology, astrology is not about looking to the stars to try to understand something about the past of the universe. It's looking at patterns within the stars, how they interrelate with the individual based upon when they were born, to attempt to predict something about the present and about the future. So while both astronomy and astrology center themselves on the study of the stars. They're disciplines that don't have to come into conflict because they have highly different purposes. So I would argue that history as a social science and faith also do not have to be in conflict. They are both essential parts of the human experience, and one can look at things both as a social scientist and compartmentalize things here, and also look at things as a person of faith without having to have that conflict in between. So, as we go through our early years, particularly studying early religions, we will attempt to be as sensitive to these issues as possible to differentiate between the traditions brought forward through faith-based analysis versus the traditions brought forward through social scientific analysis. So if we're going to study history, is the social scientist is interested in a scientific analysis of where human origins come from. And most people involved in the social sciences would agree with, to a certain extent, while there are still some questions here and there, with Darwin's theory of evolution. Based upon fossil records, these people who are scientists, whatever that means, claim that this species called Homo sapien, that we originated in Africa. The earliest evidence of Homo sapiens, archaeologists who pieced together is they believe Homo sapiens originated as a species around the year 300,000 BCE. And to keep that in context, particularly with this being a college level course, is that we are not going to use some of the traditional ways of looking at dates where we say BC and AD, is we will try to use the scientific terminology. BCE standing for before Common Era, and CE standing for Common Era. While these terminologies still revolve around the timing of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, it's a more inclusive and scientific terminology to say that there's a common era that happens after the birth of Jesus because that young man transformed the entire pattern of global development and has had a huge lasting influence. So it's still giving tribute to that, but it's taking away the elements of the faith-based with it. So if we look at the archaeological evidence, what we'll see is what defined Homo sapien as a unique mammal species was our ability for bipedalism, essentially standing up straight. Along with this, our opposable thumbs, which means we can grasp things. If you can grasp things, you can pull things from trees, bushes to eat, and you can also shape tools, shape pottery, build homes, and to build weapons for hunting. In the early parts of human civilization, and really if you look at the data and the big picture, for about 99% of the Homo sapien experience, human beings did not have what we would call civilization, is that we lived a nomadic hunter-gatherer life, and that what helped to take human beings out of Africa and to other places throughout the world was that their migration was based upon following animals and attempting to hunt these animals for food and to utilize different elements of the animal for the building of different tools based upon bones, sometimes shelter based upon the skins. What we can see from early elements of the Homo sapien experience as hunter-gatherer was from the very beginning is that we had some type of social structure starting to come along. Now, I'm not talking about social structure like in modern days of a pyramid where you have your 1% up here that owns, well, everything, and the rest of the people down here. What we're talking about here is a social structure based upon elements of gender division. Gender is something that has changed with different civilizations and has constantly been in elements of flux, but there has always been a distinction between the different genders and what roles they would play within a human society. So, based upon archaeological evidence, we have found that the male role in these hunter-gatherer societies was to go out hunting, oftentimes hunting in groups, older men bringing younger men, teaching them the skills they needed to hunt animals and to not get killed themselves. Because prior to the invention of things such as the bow and arrow and things such as guns, hunting animals can be quite dangerous. The role that women played was oftentimes a more nurturing role based upon the preservation of children and life within these small temporary villages that people would put together. Essentially, females from the very early start were based upon elements of creation and preservation, and men in the process of hunting, while the end result was to get something to preserve human life, is that the men early on took on a role of a destructive force, of the killers, while the women were the ones who nurtured and gave birth. What's unique, though, based upon elements of the archaeological evidence, were some of the cultural trends that came up early on in tribal society, particularly concepts about faith. Based upon elements of burial plots, we can see that early Homo sapien, even in these times of hunter-gatherer society, believed in some type of essence of what one could call a soul, or something eternal about us. If we look at burial plots, oftentimes we would see that people would be buried in close proximity together. And archaeologists have easily pieced together that what that meant is that those people were part of some type of family, and that they believed that by having their bodies together, that there was something eternal about them that would live on together in some type of afterlife. One of the neatest elements of archaeological evidence about early human culture is the role of pets, particularly, as they like to say, man's best friend, the dog. Pause. So these little creatures, we figured out how to become friends with them early on, and they like becoming friends with us. And one of the things that's very endearing that archaeologists have found is oftentimes in digging up graves and looking at human remains is seeing a human skeleton and right next to it, their dog. And the idea that somehow being connected in this life is they would somehow in the future still be connected. Along with this, early tribal people oftentimes got themselves involved with elements of cave art. Cave art was usually doing different images of animals to try and communicate to others about the process of hunting, to communicate where good hunting grounds were, to show images of what the animals were like, and to warn them of the fiercer animals that might be dangerous to hunt. Now, the issue with this in hunter-gatherer societies is we can't yet call these elements civilization. Most of these tribes consisted usually of 30 to 50 people who would travel around together. They would follow animals around to hunt, and they would have little pets like my little gypsy, who you saw in the introductory video, skateboarding with me. What we'll see, though, is within several thousand years of human beings creating these small tribal social units, is human beings starting to find ways of settling down in areas to start creating the basis of civilization. So the great question then is, what is a civilization, and what does one need to create and to sustain a civilization? The key element to this is the ability to grow food consistently, which means human beings needed access to water. So what we'll see is the first several civilizations that we will look at in this class, and if we were a world history class, we would look at far more civilizations involved in this in areas such as India, as China, is that we will look at elements of areas where we have river valleys, essentially where two rivers are going across each other. There's areas in between, and it's easy to start doing elements of irrigation. Once these river valleys facilitated elements of irrigation, is the irrigation allowed people to grow crops on a consistent basis and to start having a larger yield of food, so people lived longer and their lives felt more settled. Once people had figured out how to grow food by utilizing elements of irrigation from river valleys, then people could settle down, and not everyone needed to be involved in farming. welcome to the birth of cities. Cities early on were based upon elements of the trading of products and particularly of food. But the main issue with things is once people moved into a city and you needed less people involved in farming, is we started having within early civilization what we would call a division of labor, where some people were involved when producing some types of products, such as food, and other people had spare time to train to create other products, such as pottery, such as weapons, such as tools, such as bricks to build homes, such as the ability to build palaces for people to rule over individuals in these cities. Because once we started having the back and forth movement of products, is people needed some type of way to figure out what the value was of that product. So very early on with civilization is we had the creation of different types of monetary units. What we'll see over time is different civilizations utilizing things such as simply a token piece of metal with an image on it, just so people know how much that is supposed to be worth. And over time, people figure out to make coins out of very specific rare precious metals. I've argued that that coin itself as a precious and unique metal was somehow more valuable than other metals you could shape into coins. Which means people needed to have governments. Because governments, while oftentimes people have criticisms of governments in the modern world, is that governments help to provide a sense of social cohesion. First and foremost is governments can provide some type of regulation when it comes down to homes and when it comes down to trade. If one is going to build cities and start building civilizations, you can't just simply haphazardly build houses in different spots. You need very early on the elements of urban planning, of where houses go, who should live in these different types of houses, and where establishments of trade should be, what we call in modern times markets. You need to have these separate distinct units and have specific ways of making sure that they stay functional. Along with this though, since we are having the exchange of goods and the exchange of money, we have to figure out some type of way to make sure that people don't kill each other or rob each other. Hence, very early on, unlike our own nation where we have our own unique distinctions of the separation of church and state, is that most governments in early civilizations will be led by religious leaders. The reason why something like this is so powerful is that the religious leaders, early religions, as we'll study in a number of civilizations, were about trying to find ways to understand elements of natural phenomenon, whether it be storms, whether it be earthquakes, whether it be the ability for these different rivers to flood and to assist in irrigation, is that these religious leaders claimed that they had power over these different elements by interacting with different deities associated with natural elements, and that they could help to keep things stable. But along with this is very often city-states in early civilizations, is that each city-state would have its own unique god associated with that. In particular, we'll focus on that when we talk about very unique elements of ancient Greece, particularly the rivalry between Athens and between Sparta. This is Sparta! How many of you seen the movie 300? That's the sucky thing about online school. I can't see a lot of people raise their hand. So, along with this, having some type of religion and having a religious leader ruling over people, particularly once people started more and more trying to collectively understand a concept of an eternal soul, is that very early natural religions also talked about that if one did not follow the rules set forward by the religious leader, who was also a government leader, that there might be some type of eternal punishment associated with this, or if you were good and followed the rules, perhaps an eternal reward. By buying into these different concepts of the eternity of the soul, and by vesting some type of legitimate authority in the leadership of these different religious individuals, is it helped each of these cities and each of these civilizations to have some type of collective meaning. If we think oftentimes with our own nation, even though we have our traditions of separation of church and state, if you talk with many Americans, as many Americans will say, that the United States is a Christian nation, that it was founded by Christians to be a Christian nation, and that there's something unique about that. Now, if we look at the social science behind that, there's elements that we can bring up questions about, but for many people, it does give us a unique sense of collective meaning when we have things based upon our labels upon our currency, based upon our Pledge of Allegiance, where we say phrases such as, "one nation under God," or "in God we trust," is it gives our people who live within this territory a sense of a collective unity with each other. So as I said in many of my opening statements, the study of history is not the study of trivia. The study of history is about the study of the human experience. And we look to things that happened in the past to try and give us some type of sense about where we are in the present and the unique connections we have with our ancestors of the past. What is truly unique and amazing about the Homo sapien as a mammal was the very essential building blocks that came in early on of the essential role of faith. While this faith can manifest in a whole variety of different ways, what faith is really about is inspiring hope that during bad times things will get better, and love, about people trying to find a connection between themselves, between other people, people that they might call family, people that they might call spouses, or a concept of a connection between themselves and something larger and greater than them. Most of the early religions will involve an element of the sun, that the sun is the nourisher and the giver of life, that the sun each morning resurrects after an evening of a battle with darkness. We will see this as a common theme throughout things, and that since the sun provides life and nourishment and sustains things such as crops, is that most of the early gods will be associated with the sun. What faith offers to humanity is it gives our lives a sense of purpose and a sense of hope. Because really, at the end of the day, what it means to be human is to connect with others. Because connection, at the end of the day, is why we are here. Along with this, while in modern times, particularly in Western civilization, we talk about concepts of individualism, or since the late 19th century, social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, is that the whole reason why Homo sapiens were able to survive and to thrive and create civilizations was that Homo sapiens, based upon their own experience, and many scientists would argue that this got written into our DNA in many ways, is that the Homo sapien, when it comes down to our values, is that our values are oftentimes more community-oriented values. Because in order for groups to survive, the Homo sapien needs to have a collective instinct that I assist this other person, not just because I feel a connection for them, but in assisting them, that person in turn will assist me in the future. And that we have unique people that we would call family, people who have created biologically, our children, that we have a connection with, that we want to protect, that we have unique communities that have different unique values and different unique resources, and that we feel a need to come together as a community to protect these things. I would argue that the real lesson to learn from early Homo sapien is that what it means to be human is that we've got a unique energy and spark. As Doctor Who is one of my favorites. Doctor Who once said, "We're all just stories in the end. Just make it a good one." Each of us want to leave some type of legacy, and there are different ways to try to have a creative expression. One way is through biological reproduction that's based upon my own values, my own unique characteristics. I try to find somebody else who also has desirable unique characteristics, and that together we come through in a biological format, and that we create an expression of our unique connection together. Along with this, humans from very early on are going to create art. They're going to create song. Written language at first is going to be for documenting different aspects of law and economic transactions, and then once that basis is there, is that language will be about the expression of emotions, the documentation of our own lives. Because at the end of the day, we all want to be remembered. And the ability to create an individual memory of ourselves and a collective memory of us together is really the definition of what humanity is all about. Anyways, I hope you have enjoyed this first introductory lecture about early Homo sapiens and what Western civilization is. Our next lecture is we will focus in on one of the very early civilizations that ironically is based in the Middle East, but its associated Western civilization, even though in modern times we would not define the Middle East as part of Western civilization. We would define it as part of the East. In other words, we are going to look at what we would call in modern days Iraq, and in ancient days an area we would call Mesopotamia, also nicknamed the Fertile Crescent. So, I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. You will have 3 essay question prompts to write about. Take those 3 questions, write me a minimum 1-page essay based upon the format that we laid out in the quiz, and utilize the template that I've given you. There's no reason why you can't get this completely correct on the very first try, because I've given you all the tools and resources. And tell me what you think. Essentially, the questions are going to involve, what is unique about Western civilization? What is distinct about it in different ways? What's needed for civilization? And a great question: if you could transform your own life, would you ever take advantage of an opportunity? And I'm not talking some silly thing about going back in time, but to choose to no longer participate in this modern civilization. Particularly with the corona pandemic that's been going on, there's been a lot of deep-seated questions and anxieties that human beings have talked about together and thought about as individuals of what in the hell does modern civilization mean? Good question. We don't have an answer yet, but that's why we look to the past. So, I look forward to reading your essays. Take care, and next time we will make a mess of